Hello, everyone. Welcome to Teaching with Magic, a podcast exploring the intersection of education, fantasy, and literacy. Here at Teaching with Magic, we explore the different ways that teachers in the fiction and in the real world make magic for their students. You'll hear discussions about teachers and teaching methods in fantasy, science fiction, and pop culture. You'll hear interviews with scholars in various fields about important topics in education, and you'll get to be a part of an ongoing conversation about why the imagination matters. Welcome to Teaching with Magic. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Teaching with Magic. The holiday season is upon us. The kids are going crazy, and there are going to be some days where you just want to put on a movie and kick back. I'm here today with my dear friend and mentor, Dr. Maggie Parke, who transformed my thinking when it comes to how books are adapted to film and other media, and the questions that one can ask when analyzing this transition. Dr. Maggie Parke is a professor and director of Signum Studios at Signum University, who focuses on the adaptation processes of event films and fan management. Her research included working on the sets of Twilight, Captain America, and the Academy Award-shortlisted short, Love at First Sight. Try saying shortlisted short 10 times fast. My goodness. Right. She also investigated the gaming industry, researching with Turbine Inc. on The Lord of the Rings Online, also known as LOTRO, and DC Comics' Infinite Crisis. Maggie co-hosts and co-produces Rings and Realms and Other Minds and Hands at Signum Studios with Dr. Corey Olsen. Hi, Maggie.
Hi, Lise. How are you?
I'm great. Welcome, and welcome to the holiday season.
Woohoo! It's finally upon us. Although my Christmas lights have been up for like a month, so sorry, not sorry.
Also, living in the UK, you don't have Thanksgiving to kind of give you that little marker there. You just have Halloween, and then you can go straight into Christmas, I suppose.
I mean, this house has Thanksgiving, but yeah, as a neighborhood, as a nation, no. I just went straight into Christmas.
Yeah. So I'm really excited for today because we're going to talk about adaptation theory, and we're going to talk about how to bring those ideas into the classroom. And we're going to talk about some of these ideas through the lens of a very popular and almost timeless adaptation, A Christmas Carol.
Yay.
So when I first met you, Maggie, you taught me about adaptation theory through the lens of another quite timeless adaptation, the King Arthur legend. So that was pretty fascinating. I got to see all kinds of, it really helped me understand exactly what adaptations are. And before then, I was the kind of person who just thought there needed to be a full-time job of somebody just following the director around with the book in hand. Yeah. And just whacking them on the head.
Which, I mean, oftentimes that's what some of us want. I mean, we really could use that kind of quality control for beloved texts, but it's not quite how it works all the time. No.
Yeah. So then how does it work? What is adaptation theory? And what are some of the topics that somebody can ask when they're studying an adaptation?
I mean, this is a huge topic, so we'll just give some general ideas. I feel like I should also just warn everybody, if you're familiar with any of my shows or broadcasts, you have met my dog Merlin before. He will make an appearance at some point. He does not exist quietly in my space, so he will show up.
No, he does not.
No,
he does not.
He's always here. So adaptation, I mean, I got into it for the same reason everybody else does, is you feel very strongly about adaptations, right? Like, we read these texts by ourselves. We have these very personal, individual experiences, painting the picture in our head from the words that we're reading. No one can tell us it's wrong because my imagination made it. This is how it is. So we've created this world. We have this very one-to-one relationship with these characters, and then you step into a film and it's different than you envisioned. So therefore it is wrong. That's the first and biggest hurdle of adaptation. Going into, and this is as an audience member, going into a film with an open mind is one of the most difficult things you can possibly try to do. Speak of the devil. One of the most difficult things you can possibly try to do. And now I'm kind of at the point with adaptation where I just try to subdue the pitchforks and the torches and keep the mob at bay. I try to walk in with an open mind and enjoy it. There's a lot of different techniques and issues and topics that kind of come up with adaptation that are just good to be aware of the process. And I think good to be aware of how things have to happen. We would all love to see a 9-hour film based on our favorite book. I mean, I look forward to any of my favorite texts being turned into a whole season. Like book one is 10 1-hour episodes. Yes, please. Excuse me, but that often doesn't happen. We usually get an hour and a half to 2.5 hour film based on the text that we love. So things have to be cut purely for time and money, because we're not going to spend $150 to go see a cinema ticket either. It has to be within a certain remit. So decisions have to be made to cut things. But also the visual medium is just so different than a textual medium. So I think learning the language of film is one of the most important skills you can have going into it. And some of the language is the actual terms used, but some of it I also mean visual language. So terms used, there's different things that you can look at. Interpolation and explanation are some of the big ones, and elision. That's additions and subtractions from text, things that you add, things that you remove. Things that you add are often super contentious because you took away something I love from the book and you added this thing that's not even in the book. So people get quite upset about that. But you have to just kind of take a breath and think about, why might they have done this? What would be the reasoning of adding something like this? And it might be to connect two scenes because they've removed the natural bridge that was there before, so they have to add something to make sure A gets to B. You can be sad about losing the textual bridge, but you still need to get from A to B. So how are we going to do that? You come up with a new way to do that. So there are these certain like additions and subtractions that can just be really difficult. And I'm not saying you have to love what the film does, but I think you have to have an open mind to try to understand why they were doing what they were doing. Otherwise, you're going to hate everything you go see all the time. You have to just attempt to realize that the film can be a different thing. And I like being able to try to enjoy something as much as possible. Otherwise, you're just burning your own bridge. Like, go try to enjoy it. If you hate it, we can discuss. But the main term that comes up with adaptation is fidelity. And that is one of the most difficult terms for a lot of reasons. There's a lot of like super emotionally charged words in adaptation studies. Fidelity, faithfulness, betrayal, bastardization. I mean, there are a lot that are pretty heavy. So you can see people are super emotional about their adaptations. So again, you have to try to shelve some of that because we're not taking a word for word adaptation. Very rarely do you get what's called a close adaptation. Very rarely do you get a close adaptation unless you're doing like an exact Shakespearean play and you have every single word in the text in the film. That doesn't usually happen. So when you're switching from a text to a film, you need to rely on other things, visual language, film language, to tell the story that your book has told through pages and pages and pages. So the example I often give is a scene from Harry Potter that's about 75 pages long. And it's when they are getting so bored, wandering, trying to find Horcruxes, not sure where they're going, just over and over and over again. In the film adaptation of that, there's one scene where they have a fight with Ron. He leaves. They apparate to a new location. So now it's just Hermione and Harry. And Harry is standing on this really rocky, treacherous looking outcropping with the tent in the background. And he's kind of looking off into the distance. And the only patch of light is coming from around the tent. So he's on this super uncertain ground. He's not framed well. It just looks shaky. And the only thing that's solid and bright and comforting is where his friend is in the tent over in the corner. So all this stuff is going on that is telling you to just go towards that comfort and go towards that light. Merlin's having a little moment. So instead of having 75 pages of uncertainty and frustration of not knowing what to do, we have one scene of a friend having a fight and then a friend left behind on this treacherous footing being drawn towards the third friend for a bit of comfort. And that takes about, I don't know, 15 seconds of screen time. So it's not the same. We can miss what we've lost, but you do have different ways to tell a story. So it's just kind of keeping that stuff in mind. I can wax on about this stuff forever, guys. So just be aware of that. But I think when you're taking a text and moving it to a film, you've got to understand that performance can change things. Music can change things. Lighting says so much about what's going on. Camera angles are like your biggest storytelling device in a depiction of something, of like whose point of view are we looking at? Who's in charge in this scene? Who's threatened in this scene? So much of that is told to us by what we see and how we see it. You don't even notice it sometimes until somebody kind of walks you through it and explains it. Whereas in a book, we have pages and pages to tell us that he felt threatened when so and so came upon him, and so you can work your way into that. But
Yeah. How often do you get the dramatic sting when you're going, just going through the grocery store? You don't have as much as we would like it. I would love to have a soundtrack to my life. I don't think I'm going to get that anytime soon.
no, but sometimes it's fun to find that movie soundtrack that you think matches your life and listen to that while you're in the grocery store and just
Yeah,
walk that line. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, that fidelity trap is really easy to fall into, especially when you're doing a beloved book to film or book to TV adaptation. There are certain things that you want to get right. But what are, you mentioned camera angles, there's some other things that we could look for. So I remember you gave a presentation at New England Moot, and you had this great presentation moment where you had all the participants take a moment from The Hobbit. Yeah, it was the
It was
good
the
morning
opening.
scene.
Yeah.
And even though we already have one, thanks to Peter Jackson, you gave us all the opportunity to think about the camera angle. If I were the director of this film, where would I put Gandalf? Can you talk us through that exercise a little bit so we can sort of envision like how directors might be thinking about that transition from book to TV or book to film?
Sure. I mean, for that one, we took a specific segment of text, and it was the opening section of The Hobbit. And they describe a lot of what's going on and the first movements and interactions between characters. So a lot of things are happening in that scene. We are understanding the world that we're in. We're understanding the boundaries of the world that we're in. These people live in houses. They interact with each other. Their doors are round. They seem to like food. There are these certain things that build the character in terms of prop and discussion and behavior with each other and things like that, that you can choose how to show it. So, if you're reading an opening paragraph that describes a setting and interaction and there are props involved, play all that out. What kind of props? Are the plates pewter or wood or china or glass? Paper plates with a Disney character on them? I mean, each of those is going to tell you something totally different. If it's fine china with chips on it, that's going to tell me something very different than fine china that is pristine and polished with no cracks in the glaze at all. That is royalty versus a charity shop. So just in the plate, I'm being told a whole lot of story. And that's just the plate. So when you start to like play around with costume,
Oh,
paint on the wall, art, the picture frames around the art. Is it original oil painting? Is it a hand carved frame? Like all these different things that you are choosing. Nothing in a film is ever an accident. Somebody's whole job is to go out and purchase those things to make it look a certain way. So there's the world building side of it that I think is hugely important. But then there's also the storytelling side of it. So the decisions that a director, or in this case, the workshop attendees had to make was who are we looking at and how are we looking at them? So the main character was Bilbo, and I believe we did the scene where he was coming to his front door.
Yeah.
Um, so it was Bilbo coming to his front door. Are we in the house behind him, watching him walk to the front door? Or
Mm,
are we outside and we are walking to the front door? Or are we outside, far away, omnipotent, not actually in the scene, just watching what's happening far away from us? So there's so many different ways that you could tell that scene too, and each of those things is going to make you feel differently. If I'm in the house behind Bilbo, I, as a viewer, am going to be super curious of who I actually am because is somebody else in the house? Like,
yeah.
is there another little person behind Bilbo? Or is this just a very personal view of what's going on with Bilbo that I get to have access to the house? All of that is just camera lens, but it's giving me a different way to tell the story. So you have
Right.
to establish those kinds of lenses first. And I don't mean camera lenses, I mean like storytelling lenses.
Hmm.
And I remember an example that somebody told me about with Avengers, because I worked on Captain America for a little bit, like 2 days, nothing crazy. But
Aw.
I was like, yeah, but I was like, how do you decide like who gets to do what? This is well after Captain America and Avengers and the first few films were out. And I was talking to one of the producers, and they were like, go back and watch Avengers and know that Captain America is the lens. He's the through line. And I was like, what?
Mm,
Watch it again, guys. Because he's not, that doesn't mean he's the main character. It means that he drives action forward. It means that things happen because of him, because he says something, or he finds something, or he makes two characters talk to each other, or he happens to be in a space where something is discovered. Like it's him that drives the story forward. So they chose him as kind of the through line. It doesn't work 100% of the time, but it's like 90% of the time. But yeah, so there's
that makes
different,
perfect sense.
right? And same with Harry Potter. I know Harry was the lens. So there's loads of stuff that happened away from Harry that they cut, and people were sad about that, house elves and things like that. Like there are definite
Right.
elements of the story that were completely removed that people are upset about. But if it didn't immediately affect Harry's storyline, it was on the chopping block. And if there was a way for them to describe whatever that storyline did to influence Harry's storyline, that they didn't need to keep that line, it was gone.
Right.
So Harry was the through line.
Yeah, it makes sense from a producing standpoint and from a, literally a time standpoint. I can't, that's Order of the Phoenix is what, 800, 900 pages. So
Yeah.
that's a long Netflix series right there.
Ugh,
That's an entire
that'd be
Netflix
nice.
season.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, there's just these massive decisions that have to be made. And it sounds so cruel, like you have to cut it down, you have to cut it down. Well, no, you have to figure out how to tell that differently, is the way
Yeah.
to kind of turn your brain. We're not looking for a one-to-one. As much as I would love a one-to-one of certain stories, it's never going to be the same because they're different mediums. So
Yeah.
abandon that thought. Like, you're never going to have the same experience. You might love both. That's the dream.
Mm,
If you can love the book and you can love the film and understand and appreciate that they're two separate things. Ready Player One. I
mm.
love Ready Player One. I love the book and I love the film. They are so different from each other. But I absolutely love what they did because they took an idea and they figured out what they were trying to do, tell this really cool story using a bunch of pop culture in a not too distant future. And they just did it in two different ways. And it was great. It was fantastic.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of what you literally talk about in Other Minds and Hands and in Tolkien's letter to Milton Waldman, where he talks about other minds and hands. There are certain things that you can do with the original that aren't going to work in a visual medium,
Mhm.
but if you stick to the core of the original, at least, I don't remember if did he say the core? Did he talk about the core of the original in the Milton Waldman letter? I'm sure somebody out there is going to correct me on this, probably. Um, but there's a difference between fidelity and the core of the original, at least in my personal opinion, because there's telling the story and then there's telling the story and then there's copying the story word for word, letter for letter, which is difficult to do. I mean, that's why Tom Bombadil is so hard to so hard
Get right. Yeah.
to get right. You can't get Tom Bombadil right because nobody knows who Tom Bombadil is. Not even I don't think Tolkien himself even knew who Tom Bombadil
No,
is.
and he changed his mind about it a dozen different times. So, like, which version
Exactly.
of Tom are we getting, and how are you showing it? Then, yeah,
And
there's
which Tom Bombadil do we legally have the rights to is the other
exactly.
question.
Rights is a whole other conversation, guys. That's different. But I mean, like Other Minds and Hands, the broadcast, that came out of Corey and I having these conversations and him wanting to have a space where we could discuss things using just analysis and not opinion. So that's what the core of Other Minds and Hands was. We want to look at the object in front of us and see what we're being told, not
Mm-hmm.
compare it to the original and say, oh, but that happened and that's different. It's so easy to fall into that comparison trap. Chapter one did this, but scene one did this. We can't do it that way. We've got to say, here's what's happening in the story, here's what we know from the text, and here's what we're being shown in the film or the show. And isn't it interesting that they're trying to maybe show that dynamic in this way? So there's
Mm-hmm.
different ways you can kind of talk around it that I think we get criticized sometimes for being like overly positive. And I'm like, we're not trying to be positive or negative. We're trying to figure out the puzzle. And
Right.
that's what's so fun. So if we have fun with it, sorry, not
Yeah.
sorry.
God forbid we have joy in our lives. Boo.
What? Especially when talking about books and films that we love. Come on. Yeah,
Gasp. Lay gasp.
madness.
Um, yeah, there are definitely some things that I mean, I came to the Lord of the Rings through the films first.
Me
So there are
too.
some things that colored my perspective. But then as I got older, I was able to kind of tear away those two ideas. So I could see what Peter Jackson was trying to do, and I could see Tolkien's original vision. But
Yeah.
that sort of thing took time for me to
And
wrap my
if
head around.
And if you listen to Corey talk about it too, he had the same journey where he didn't like the films at first and talked himself around and through to see what was happening and then was quite amazed by what was accomplished. So
Yeah.
it happens to the best of us that sometimes you just need a bit of time. Sometimes you need a little bit of distance from the text that you love to forget it a tiny bit so you're not so
Hmm.
critical,
Yeah.
and
But
practice.
it's also just amazing to think about what goes into a film. I think when I visited Weta Workshop, I came to Weta Workshop not just through Lord of the Rings, but also I was obsessed with the Chronicles of Narnia when I was
Narnia.
15.
So good.
And oh my gosh, I when I saw their model of Cara Paravel
Yeah.
when I got to New Zealand, I about wept. My poor husband. He's just standing there going, "Yeah, this is cool, but I don't know if I'd weep over this." But
You're like, then go over there. I need a
yeah,
minute. Yeah.
yeah. I'm just like, I don't know. But I saw just how much work goes into thinking about individual characters and individual, like just thinking about the individual weaponry and the difference between a weapon for a satyr, perhaps, versus a centaur. Like, oh, you actually have to think about a centaur's anatomy and adapt a sword to fit a
Yeah.
centaur, like fitting the entire horse. It's amazing.
Yeah, I mean the world building we talk about a lot and it's just so wonderful to fall down that rabbit hole and what is such a great example of it. With the Lord of the Rings Traveling Museum exhibit they did right after the trilogy came out, there was a whole bit on the oh gosh, I'm losing the word. When you go into battle, the armor. Sorry. Whew, the armor. It's not even that difficult. It's just late here. The armor, and they were talking about the chainmail and then the layers that would go over the chainmail and what would you wear under the chainmail and what would the chainmail be made out of and how would it be constructed because what was available to these people and how would they forge those rings and how tense could it get? How thick could the wire be? Like they're
Yeah.
talking legit creation of functional chainmail and then they made it by hand. Yeah.
And then the actors had to wear it.
Yeah. A
Fun
lot.
times, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I mean, that's heavy stuff.
Yeah.
I put on a light version of a chainmail shirt once and I almost buckled. Oh my
Yeah.
gosh.
They're intense
Very
and hot.
intense.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's not fun, but also it's kind of fun. I would absolutely do it. Yeah.
But it's what makes it real, right? So like you want that level of detail, you want that level of care put into
Hmm.
the text that you care about so much. So the trajectory that we've kind of started seeing since Lord of the Rings and what my PhD work was on was about how filmmakers work with fandoms and kind of communicate to fandoms.
Yeah.
And one of the big things we see is them portraying themselves as fans and taking care of the work and being stewards of the core of the story and
Hmm.
things like that, using all of these phrases to hopefully gain our trust. Because when someone gets a hold of your favorite story and they don't care about it, there's trouble.
Hmm.
And I'm sure if anybody's ever heard me talk about it, Susan Cooper is mine. And
Yeah.
that, yeah, one of her books was turned into a terrible film in 2007 that I will never forgive MTV Studios, which is now defunct because they did such a bad job. Yeah. But they took the story and only the producer had ever read it. None of the actors, one of the actors didn't even know it was part of a series, so they had no awareness of what they were participating in and how much care they should be taking of it. And oddly enough, that backfired.
Yeah. I saw the previews for that, and I haven't read Susan Cooper's work, but just based on what I saw in that preview and what you have told me of Susan Cooper, that was not it.
That was not it.
It
Yeah.
was not it.
It might be a fun film. Like, I feel like there's part of me that can say, oh, it's an entertaining Christmas film, but it's not my
It's
book.
not Susan Cooper.
Why would you even call it that? They
No.
took your 11-year-old British hero and made him a 14-year-old American boy with a love interest and a twin trapped in an alternate dimension and got rid of the Arthurian mentions entirely, which is the core of the story. So, it's fine.
So note to producers out there, read the book. Note
Yeah,
to all everybody participating in the film, read the
yeah.
book.
And like this, I feel like we're going off topic, but I'm kind
Yeah.
of okay with it because this is my message of like, you have to read the book to be aware of the impact. You don't have to read the book to be a slave to the book. You are allowed to make changes.
Yeah.
As an artist, that's what you get to do. And if you want to tell a story in a different way, you have every right and kind of the wonderful power to be able to do that. But you have to be prepared to explain why you change things,
Right.
especially for a beloved text. And if you don't have a good reason, then why are you using that book? Just go write an original story, you know? So
Yeah.
that's kind of the process of like, you don't have to be a slave to it, but you need to be aware of what you're engaging in.
Yeah. I mean, you don't have to. I mean, I remember being peeved that there were certain scenes missing from Harry Potter 1, but I was 11 at the time, so forgive me. But at the same time, you don't have to have every word for word for word. It was Norbert. I was mad about Norbert. That's what it
Oh,
was.
that was good. Yeah.
It was like it was that part was kind of skated over a little bit, but I understand why they did that. That was a lot of exposition going on there, and
Yeah.
that would have been, a whole mini episode on its own. So, but don't do what Dark is Rising did.
No,
Don't do that.
no.
Don't do that.
Take care of your text.
Yeah, take care
Be
of it.
aware of it.
It's
And,
your baby. Know your
and do a
baby.
little media training with your cast and crew. If they're ever going to have an interview where they're asked about the books, make sure they know that there's a book.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
kind of important.
Basics.
Somebody, yeah. I think somebody did that in Star Wars at one point. Somebody, I don't know. You can't mess up Star Wars in public. You just can't. You'll be
No.
crucified. So then what questions should we consider? Yeah, what questions should we consider if we're looking at an adaptation for a fantasy or a science fiction novel? I mean, when we can adapt so let's say historical fiction or any other kind of fictional story. But then what are the specifics we should consider for a fantasy or science fiction novel? And where should students begin when they're analyzing the original work and the adaptations?
I'm going to start with that second part. Where should students start? Not in direct comparison.
Cool.
So try very hard because anytime there's an adaptation, you can 100% go to Google and say book versus film, and you will find YouTube videos, you will find Excel spreadsheets of book versus film comparisons. Like it's an easy exercise. It's a handy exercise to see changes and what's kept and what's dropped. And I find it now to be a really interesting way to get a cool data set because I can do a comparison and then see what's been cut and then start to think about why they might have cut that. And then it's informative. So like I can start to figure out thought processes and things like that. Interesting. Don't do it as a see, haha, they got it wrong.
Yeah, you don't
So
want to rack up points. That seems silly.
no, that's not really the point. Yeah. I mean, I think shelving the direct comparison, but being aware of big picture things. I mean, I love looking at character analysis in adaptation. So,
Mm.
like a lot of Hermione and Ron's lines are changed between book and film, and that's kind of interesting. Like, tell me more. So, starting to take a look at who gets what lines, what characters are cut. Um, Not just for comparison, but how they're building their story. So maybe there were too many characters in the text and we had more time to learn them in a text. So, with Twilight, they cut a bunch of the high school friends and combined certain characters. So one character carried the lines of three characters from the books. Makes a lot of sense. We don't need to know a lot of detail about these characters because they're not that well developed and they don't have a lot of depth to them. So we don't really need three names when we could just learn one and get what we need from them, which is a graduation speech or, I don't know, exposition about that weird family. Like there's certain background that they can provide. So taking a look through a different lens, I think, can be quite helpful if you just want to take a look at big picture characters. Big picture enemies, that's a pretty good one too. Who's the big bad? How's the big bad revealed? What's the rising action against that big bad? When do we figure out that they're the big bad? And what's their motivation? And how does that relate to the hero's story? Because in those bigger picture conversations, you'll tend to recognize your text a lot more clearly and maybe start to see how the filmmakers and why the filmmakers were making the decisions they made. Sometimes that doesn't work out though. Like all I'm saying is go in with the open mind and try to figure out what they're doing. That doesn't mean they're going to accomplish it. You're still allowed to leave mad because they mucked something up and you didn't want them to do it that way. And it's such a missed opportunity for this thing that you love. But I like to try to start with an open mind and maybe attempt to figure out how I could like it. What was the first part of the question too? Science fiction and fantasy.
Yeah. What should we consider when we're looking at a science fiction adaptation, or a fantasy adaptation? Because there's a lot more to try to accomplish than in, say,
Hmm.
a historical fiction piece or an adaptation of maybe a modern day novel.
Well, there is and there isn't, to be honest. I mean, there's a lot of specifics and particulars about world building that I think you need to work on. And I don't want to say get right because who's to say what's right? It needs to fit the expectation of each individual reader. So it's really difficult to do that. So I think there's a certain amount of world building that has to be super believable in the director and art director creator's eye. Because if it's believable in their eye, then it will work for most people watching it. But if that team doesn't agree and things don't make sense, it's never going to make sense to viewers. So I do think there's a certain added pressure of world building and a lot of those things, like how that measures down to budget. Like I remember reading something about Stardust, the Neil Gaiman story that was adapted in like 2006 or 7. It's Claire Danes. It's a wonderful
Love that film.
and a wonderful film. Yeah. But I remember watching the behind the scenes stuff back when DVDs had special features. And they were talking about going on to set. Neil Gaiman was talking about going on to set and looking up at this flying pirate ship that they had to build in a giant green screen studio. And he just looked at it and then looked at the cast and crew and said, "I'm sorry, I could have made it a car, but I didn't." So like, yeah, he could have made it a car, but instead it was a giant flying pirate ship. But so there's like certain things that they have to work around in terms of that. But I don't think there are massive differences in most adaptations because you're talking about a core text with characters and problems and challenges and decisions, and all of those things have to be believable. So just because it's fantasy, you can't just stick a magic wand in their hand and it's going to work. You have to have strong, grounded, well-developed characters that you care about, that you engage with, that you're worried what's going to happen, you know? And I think that's the same for any of them. The magic wand it shouldn't be an issue at all because you understand so much about that character. Of course, they need a magic wand that's necessary for their world. That's an afterthought. If you're just throwing lightsabers and wands and, stars and all sorts of other cliche, stereotypical things to make it look fantasy, it doesn't work. The characters in the story have to be believable.
Yeah. I mean, look at what Star Trek did in the early, they just took little balls of fluff and suddenly you have a Tribble.
Right?
And it's, they're timeless now.
Yeah.
Everybody knows, any Star Trek fan knows what a Tribble is. And they were just these little teeny balls of fluff.
That they got for like 10 for a dollar or something at a flea market or something crazy like that. And they're like, yep, here's our prop of the week.
Yep. And it worked. It's one of the more popular episodes. And, it's very memorable.
Mm-hmm. I also remember tiny, simple examples of how you can world build. Amy Sturgis in the science fiction course talked about, yeah, she's great.
Love her.
She talked about the line, the door of the spaceship dilated and they walked through. That's all you need. Like dilated. I don't even think spaceship was mentioned. The door dilated and they walked through. Normal doors don't do that.
No.
Normal doors open and close. So as soon as something dilates, you go, oh, that's where we are. It's like that can paint a real strong picture pretty clearly. And think about, like, if you guys have seen Dune, the most recent Dune, like opening shots of that. I mean, it's just so visually stunning and literally awe-inspiring that I'm immediately in that world.
Yeah.
The care that they took into world building and the costumes and the mannerisms, the mores, immediately there.
Yeah. You just got to make it, it's, the core of any good fantasy story is the world building. If you don't get that right, you don't have a good fantasy or science fiction story. I guess when I originally made this question, I was thinking of the special effects, and there are certain things that directors, or I know there was a big conversation with James Cameron about it took him like 10-15 years to make the Avatar film because the technology just wasn't there yet. So I guess that was my original thinking for this question, but I get there's some totally questions
fair though too. Yeah, I mean I think that was Tolkien. I mean this is me assuming what Tolkien might be thinking, but Tolkien said that it couldn't work. It wouldn't work for adaptation, maybe animation, but that was just laughable to him. Like this wasn't an option. Like this didn't exist what we have now. So technology.
And then Ralph Bakshi came around.
I know. And then he had to go and ruin it for everybody. No, that's an interesting one though. Like story-wise, there's some real merit and strength to the Bakshi adaptation. Visuals leave something to be desired, but
it's very Bakshi. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I do think there's something to be said for the technology matching our visual ability. Like Avatar couldn't have been made in the 90s. And even when you compare early Pixar, we were watching The Incredibles as a family the other day, and that was like 2003 or 4.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, the original Incredibles to what we see now in Pixar is incredible. Is night and day, it's just so different. And that's meant to be an animation. So animation to animation, it's just gone leaps and bounds. But when you're talking about creating a world that's supposed to look real from animation, that's a different challenge.
So which characteristics of a textual work do you think lends itself to a good adaptation? Do you think there are some stories that are more prone to adaptations while others just seem to fall flat, or is it less about the text and more about, say, a director's vision?
Probably a mix of both. I mean, I think you're not going to get a well done successful, well-received adaptation if the director doesn't have a passion. Um,
Hmm.
I think you have to have that level of engagement and care with the text if you're going to take something and bring it into a visual space. And look at any of these texts that we've mentioned from, these things that we care about, Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, like those creators have a real high bar set for them.
Yeah.
Oh, you're taking this on? Good luck. Like there's very much this like you better take care of it or. So
Hmm.
I do think there's that certain level of expectation that comes with some of that. But I feel like the director has to care about it, but the core of the story just needs to be strong. Because if there's a good story to tell, then you're going to tell it. Something like 75% of the films made are adaptations. And Best Picture nominees for the last like 20 years, 4 out of 5 of them have been adaptations. So more of them get made than anything else. And you can kind of see why. Like they already have a built-in audience. We know this
Hmm.
book is popular. People are interested in coming to see it. But also the depth of the story is there. Like we've pages and pages and pages of backstory about these characters and the world that they live in and detail to get to know them. So I think adaptation itself is just kind of always going to be a popular space. Specific stories, I think it's probably the inspiration and attachment to the human that reads them. But you don't need to have a ton to work with sometimes either. Like Stephen King's short stories, Shawshank Redemption, Green Mile, those are short stories
Yeah.
that have been turned into absolutely incredible films that are very different, very, very different from the original story. But it took that inspiration to build this world. So we started with this really strong core idea and we're able to build this much bigger. I mean, it is like fan fiction, and I think there's some wonderful fan fiction that's taking a core idea and fleshing it out and building it into something absolutely fantastic.
Yeah. I when suddenly brought to mind how many adaptations there are of Jane Austen's
Oh, so
books. I
yeah.
mean, you could write forget a dissertation, you could write an entire book series just on Jane
Oh,
Austen
yeah.
adaptations.
I mean, and you
Sure.
could you could do a whole series on just the modern ones,
Yeah.
like versus the historically accurate ones. There's so many.
Oh my gosh. I
Yeah.
mean, and we always return to them.
Hmm.
We love
And then there's Sense
a
and
good
Sensibility and Sea Monsters. I mean,
yeah,
we have and Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, right? Or
right.
vampires? I can't remember.
No, I think it's zombies. Yeah,
I
it's
mean,
Pride and
zombies.
Prejudice and zombies.
It's great.
Yeah. We
Yeah,
love
I mean,
Jane Austen and we love a Jane Austen adaptation.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, you return to these core stories. There's like 7 or 8 Little Women at this point. There's 8 or 9 Christmas carols. There are
Christmas
loads.
Carol.
Yeah. Yeah.
Christmas Carol.
It's the best.
It
Yeah.
is. Let's let's talk about a Christmas Carol a little bit. We were talking about applying some of these concepts to Christmas Carol, specifically a Muppet Christmas Carol.
My fave.
The
My fave.
favorite. The favorite. I mean, that
Also,
was yeah.
one of the closer adaptations as well. Like
I know.
Muppet Christmas Carol is actually pretty darn on the money for all of the elements of the Dickens tale, told in a different way, with a lot of additional information added in there. Rats, singing fruit.
You know, the
Yeah.
basics
The,
that you
the
have to have with a
core,
Jim Henson production.
yeah, but the core story is pretty solid for Muppet Christmas Carol.
And if I recall correctly, most of Gonzo's lines are directly
Are
from
the
the
Dick
text. They're
are
directly from the
directly,
text.
yep, directly. Go figure.
I
And you
mean,
have Michael Caine playing Ebenezer Scrooge completely straight, which is just 100% of I think why it works so well.
exactly. You can't go wrong with Michael Caine as Scrooge. No.
Just shows you performance, man. And world
Yeah.
building. Once we accept that the fruit sings, bring it. Everything's fine.
And
Tell me
there's
that
even
story.
yeah. There's even this idea that, I understand that as a Jim Henson production, I'm going to see some singing fruits and singing.
Right.
I'm going to see some chickens. I'm going to see, Gonzo falling in love with the chicken. That's
Yep.
just a core to a Jim Henson production. And then I have the world building that goes on with the Christmas Carol itself. So you've
Yes.
got two world building worlds colliding here.
Oh, I like that. So we already have these preconceptions from the Muppets and a pre-expectation from A Christmas Carol, and the way that they marry those two together just works because of all the
Yes.
passion and the care put into adapting that work.
Plus, puppetry itself, that's its own artistry
Oh yeah.
on its own. I mean, it's insane the work that goes into making these puppets.
Have you watched the new Jim Henson documentary?
I have not.
I think it's on Disney Plus. Side story. It's wonderful. Um,
Must.
yeah. But oh, completely. I mean, the way that they develop these characters as individual beings, living, breathing beings that act a certain way, and the actors that are controlling the puppets are acting and talking while doing it. So they are fully in the space, and even when the camera yells cut, those puppets are still acting. And the human actors in the film famously continued conversations with the puppets after they yelled cut. Like they just treated them as if they were members of the cast. That's the
Yeah,
level of world building believability that you need for a story to be that good.
exactly. If you're
Yeah.
going to treat, you got to treat the puppet like another actor because you have to. If I don't believe that this human actor and this puppet actor are on the same level conversation wise, that world building is broken.
hmm And I think with Christmas Carol, one of the strongest storylines that you can play with are the relationships of the characters.
Yeah.
And once the characters and the actors are so well developed, the rest of that plays off quite well. So you don't have to fight to make it seem like those two are falling in love or those two have fallen out or they don't get along. Like the world built the space around it that it makes sense for Ebenezer to not get along with Fred and his wife because he's so crotchety. Let's just watch that play out. And then the full circle at the end when they do come together is that much more believable because we have watched the whole progression of his character from terrible to forgiven.
Yeah. It's also, this is also a story that it has been adapted in many different ways, not just for a Muppet Christmas Carol. It was originally a stage production.
hmm
Well, not a stage production so much as it was written to be
It,
read aloud in staves, or like there were like four acts or something like that. I remember actually seeing Neil Gaiman read it aloud. Like he had an original copy. I was in New York City at the New York Public Library. He got up on stage. He read A Christmas Carol aloud.
of course he
So
did.
this was of course he did, and dressed in full Dickensian costume. I might
Of
add, he grew
course
out
he
his
did.
beard for the occasion.
Oh,
It was great. But he read it aloud. Dickens read it aloud to an audience. So it was meant to be performed, and then it was turned into a novel, and then it was turned into films, and then it was turned into a puppet show. And why not?
why not?
So, and I just love that this is something that has gone through so many different iterations for different
Mhm.
reasons. And it always seems to stick to the core of this is a person who seems irredeemable, but can be redeemed in the end. And I think that's a human element that we all connect to, that we all want, whatever our sins are, we can be forgiven and we can change and we
Yes.
can, you know, and of
Yeah,
course, if I have Gonzo telling me what to do, I'm going to do it.
it and if jelly beans are involved, extra bonus.
Yes.
But I think you absolutely hit the nail on the head of that story. It's the irredeemable being redeemed, that human attachment, that moment. Because Corey and I also did a series of this for Other Minds and Hands where we talked about Christmas Carol. And the one that we really got a bit stuck on was Jingled, the new Will Ferrell and Ryan Reynolds adaptation that's on Apple TV. It only came out last year and it's really entertaining. Super grown up rated, but it
Mm.
was really entertaining and really interesting to look at as an adaptation because here we are with this story we know completely turned on its head, and there's no change until the very last second. So it really made us kind of distill the focal point of this story down to the millisecond moment when they have a change of heart. And it's
Mm.
that millisecond moment that you have to hang your whole story on. So if that change is believable, then we're on board. But if
Yeah.
everything leading up to that doesn't work and the stuff after that doesn't play, then it doesn't
Hmm.
work. So yeah, I mean, I think Christmas Carol, it's just such an interesting story. And at the core of it, bad guy meant to change his ways on Christmas.
Yeah.
There's so many different ways we can tell that. And I love Scrooge too. That's one of my favorite, the Bill Murray ones.
Yeah.
You know, if you're taking another modern retelling of it, give me the same thing. Give me this terrible, despicable, you love to hate him character and watch that change happen and you believe it at the end. Like, yeah, what a great story to tell and find different ways to tell it in.
Yeah. Especially if you have, I mean, I really like hated Bill Murray's Scrooge. Like I didn't hate the performance, but I watched the film. I'm like, I really hate that guy. Like he got me
Yeah,
hating him. I'm like,
yeah.
okay, nope, you're good. You're good. You're good at your job. Yes. But like I was like, this guy cannot, there's no changing this guy. There's yeah, I cannot see how he can change and be a good guy at the end. Whereas perhaps in like Dickens's Scrooge, he's a little, he's grumpy and he's crotchety, but I could see, and because I've seen A Christmas Carol so many times, I know that he's going to change at the end. But for some reason with Scrooged, I believe it every single time. And I really get stuck on, no, he can't do it. He can't change. But somehow he does. And it's quite miraculous.
Right, and miraculous is the right word. Like, oh my God, they did it again. Even that guy.
Even that guy.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I can think of a few people who could use a Christmas Carol treatment, and maybe it'll work out, maybe it won't. But that's the magic of their imagination.
Yeah.
So I'm coming up on Christmas break, and we just finished up Thanksgiving. Christmas break is going to come soon, and boy, my kids are going to. I don't know about yours, but my kids are going to be twitchy. I know they're going to have some twitchy days. So, what general ideas do you recommend that kids should try if I'm going to put on a movie of I'm going to put on an adaptation of the book we're reading or any popular text? What are some ideas that you recommend that kids try going into an adaptation?
I mean, kids, if it's an early days thing, start with comparison. I know I just told you not to do that, but it's a good exercise and it's a starting point. And it's as long as you start with comparison, and it's not to say right and wrong, it's just comparison. So it's a good exercise to kind of take them through. If they're already past comparison, then pick a through line. See if there's something that they can focus on that every time they see it, they make a note about it. Or if it tells a story in a certain way. Like Billy Elliot was one of my first favorite films. It's not an adaptation.
Well, the
No.
stage play adapted the film.
Well, adapted from the film, yes.
There
So
you
there
go.
is a musical now on stage from the
Yeah,
film. The film
exactly.
was a film first. There was a
It
book
was.
after the film, but anyway. So like, but just as an example of film language, like I saw that probably a dozen times in the cinema. I was just hook, line, and sinker obsessed with this film. And it was the fourth or fifth time I started noticing the color blue. And every time the color blue was used, it was in some sort of relationship to his mother, and that just changed the whole tone. Same with Sixth Sense, scary movie, but watch it for the color red, see what happens. Some films, every time you see a certain book, something might be specific. So take a look at props, note things down when they come in. Day and night, what kinds of activities happen at day and night? White and black, is that signifying good and bad? Like, let's see if we can pinpoint some of the ways that they are showing you what kinds of characters these are. Camera angles, up angle, down angle. If the camera's down here looking up at somebody, I'm in a meek position, subdued, submissive. If I'm up here looking down, I'm in power. I'm looking down on someone. That camera angle tells you a ton. So, having kids look through it saying, watch the camera angles in this one, what is it? Another really fun one, but also really annoying one, which is not really adaptation focused, but I just really love doing it, is counting the seconds for shots. So a standard shot is 3 to 6 seconds. So when you're watching a movie and there's a conversation back and forth between two characters, it's usually 3 to 6 seconds on this one, 3 to 6 seconds on this one, 3 to 6 seconds on this one. when that changes, it's real interesting. So if you want to be real annoying, watch a movie and go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and count those. Because sometimes they start to get longer, or something is 10 to 15 seconds, and you're like, whoa, I'm supposed to take something in here. Something is happening. And often you're supposed to figure out where you are. It's establishment shot or something major is happening and you're supposed to suck it all in. But one of the best ones I was ever shown with this was in Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy when Gollum and Smeagol are fighting with each other. Count the seconds of the scenes, guys.
Oh my God.
Because Gollum takes up more time of the shots at the beginning. Smeagol takes up more time of the shots at the end. There's a transition in that scene where Gollum hands over to Smeagol, and just watching that happen is so cool. So yeah, that's a fun one.
I feel like I've done that subconsciously. Like I feel like I've watched a film and I've seen like a conversation between two people and I notice when it's going too fast or it's going too slowly. Like the shot, but like I'm not conscious that I'm doing this.
I mean, I think that's part of the beauty of film language, though. You're not supposed to be conscious. I mean, my job now is to point all this out. I'm going to tell you what you're seeing, and I'll tell you what I think it means. But the whole point of film language is for you to not notice it, but take that in. So you might not recognize that that's a downward angle and therefore a position of power, but you're probably going to feel it in some way. But as soon as somebody points it out to you, you're going to go, oh, that's a downward position of power. There's another one that I've ruined for my mother is Christ imagery. That there are so many films where you get this from our hero. Spider-Man is one of the most famous. Superman is one of the most famous. Like they constantly strike that pose. And it's just this very religious, iconic imagery that is placed into our superhero films. Now my mom can't watch a superhero film without being like, there it is.
Yep. There's the Jesus imagery right there.
Right there. Yep.
Yep. Peter Parker's on the yep. Even
on the front of the train. Hold it, and then he's passed back over the crowd.
Yep. He's I
and
see it.
That's not a bad thing. That imagery is purposeful to match what we already have in our minds of a heroic being, right? Like even if you're not Christian, you are familiar with that iconography. That's a tough word. You're familiar with those visuals that if you see a Marvel superhero in a similar light, you're going to match that subconsciously, whether you like it or not. Like, oh, heroic savior. I get it.
Yeah. I even, And conversely, I could take a scene from a book and I could tell my students, hey, think about, some of this film language that we've talked about. How would you depict this if you were the director in a film? What shots would you use? Kind of like what you were talking about with the Hobbit activity we did.
Totally. Well, yeah, and you had asked me before, which I imagine you're about to ask me about too, is activities.
Yeah.
And that is my favorite one to do. Like, what activity would I propose for students is an adaptation workshop. Give everybody the same scene and have them outline it or storyboard it in a different way. Storyboarding I really like because you're actually getting the visuals, and it can just be stick figures. It doesn't have to be artistic and beautiful, but it's going to show you how that shot is framed, and it's going to show you where the camera is, and it's going to tell a story in a specific visual way. And you get so many different versions of the same 6 lines of text. And it's just so powerful an example to show students how hard adaptation is. Like, this is why you hate it so much, because this is one line and this whole room came up with 30 different versions of how to tell that. I worked on a commercial years ago that the script said a rose falls from on high and hits the ground. It was like a perfume commercial or something. And it was like a rose dropping. The number of ways that rose was depicted dropping, everybody can look at that in a different way. And which one are you going to choose? And that's with something that is not based on text and have any emotion attached to it. That's just an action. But yeah, doing that with a text that you're familiar with. And then another way to do that is that, but also showing the students different versions professionally that have been done. So one of my favorites is Narnia, and doing the BBC versus the Walden Entertainment versions, the Beavers. I often use the Beavers because I love the Beavers from the BBC version. So you show the Beavers from the BBC adaptation and then show the same scene from the Walden Entertainment version.
Mhm.
And it facilitates a nice conversation about budget and technology. So we can talk about that. Budgets are very different for these two things. Technology was very different for these two things. What are we seeing story? What are we seeing character? How are they showing this space to us? How do we know that it's safe and warm, but it's actually under threat? So then you start to talk about the things that are in those two scenes. But this is after everybody in the class has already done their adaptation. So they do their adaptation and then you show them two professional examples. So you have all these different examples and then you're bringing in these two industry ones to be like, see, this is difficult. This is tricky.
Mm.
This is why it is the way that it is. And that's why it's so much fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like having the kids do it first and then showing the industry examples just because we all know
Otherwise, they'll
what,
cloud them.
yeah, and we all know what we would do if we were the directors, we had an unlimited budget, but you got a limited budget at times. And you
Yeah.
also have a different vision.
Totally. And you don't know what people are going to include either, which I really like. Like I remember with the Hobbit one that we did at New England Moot, there was one, I probably kept it. It was, first of all, such a good drawing, but they also included a number of non-speaking characters in that scene. So that's a decision. Like they're not mentioned at all in the scene. We don't think they're there, but to put them in the scene, well, that changes the trajectory a little bit now, doesn't it? And
Hmm.
that's a really powerful tool because it could absolutely take us into the next scene where that director is having those characters move the story forward or have a role that we cut out 6 scenes from the text because of time. So this is going to help move us from A to B because they are going to do XYZ, whatever it is.
Do you remember who
But
this, were they just random characters this person made up, or were they
no,
like,
they were characters within the story, but they weren't in that scene in the text.
okay,
But
that's
but that's
fascinating.
when you get to kind of start to play. How do we know they weren't in that scene in the text? They weren't
Hmm.
mentioned, but that doesn't mean they weren't there. Fair point. We can play
Hmm.
with that.
Yeah.
And ideas like that, which are a little bit higher level adaptation theory, but like that's what's been so fun with Other Minds and Hands and Rings and Realms and Rings of Power. We are not working off of a direct text with Rings of Power. It's Silmarillion, but it's not. It's appendices and it's, other mentions of other texts and things that are not a script.
Yeah.
So what are we being shown and how can we, meaning me and Corey, try to explain what's happening? Because it's just such a different puzzle to figure out. And honestly, it is so much fun because you get to start to figure out what they're referencing and how that could make sense. But it's a very different
Yeah.
kind of discussion for adaptation.
Yeah. Because you can have shades of the Silmarillion, but you can't have the Silmarillion itself.
No, yeah, it can look like the Silmarillion. It can sound like the Silmarillion,
But it cannot be the
but it
Silmarillion.
cannot be the
Otherwise, you're going to get in
Silmarillion.
trouble with the estate.
Yep. Yep.
Oh, man. JD Payne and Patrick McKay really signed themselves up for a big adventure with that one, didn't they? Holy
I think
cow.
they did it on purpose. The way their brains work, I think they loved this mess. They're
And
also
just go
fun
for
to
it.
look at with visuals though, because like, I mean, and any I don't know, imbued filmmaker would be the same, where they are so up to their eyeballs in film history. They
Yeah,
know everything that has informed film for the last 80 years, and they reference it often. So
they
like we
do.
were saying with like the Christ imagery, they're going to harken back to some 1960s cult something to have the same kind of vibe come off, or an Alfred Hitchcock scene, or something that just makes it feel like that. So it's a little bit of a geek nod because they just want to play this out themselves as film geeks. But if you know the film, then it's also handy to be like, oh, are they, is that they did that. Okay, yeah, yeah, okay, I can see that, So it's fun to play with the visuals of it.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
So what activities, or even just thinking overall, um, if I were to teach adaptation theory and fantasy, kind of like what you did with Gabriel Shank when you did that King Arthur class,
Think-
that was so much fun. I loved it. Inklings in King Arthur, that's what it was. So then how would you start with a lesson for adaptation theory and fantasy moving forward? Like what would your idea, where would you want to start?
I mean, I probably have this recorded for Signum somewhere. We can just share that lecture. But
Yeah, probably.
yeah, I mean, I always start with what adaptation theory is. So it's a little bit of an overview of terminology. And we look at elision and addition and interpolation and all these kind of changes to the text words. We talk about the difficulty of adaptation language, how it is fraught with emotion, with betrayal and faithful and things like that. So, being aware of how emotive the language of adaptation is. And
Hmm.
once you're aware of it, it's a little bit easier to shelve it because you can be like, oh, okay, I recognize that I'm saying betrayal and faithful, but I don't mean it. Like, I just mean, yeah, got it. It's helpful to kind of facilitate that. So, talking a little bit about the nuts and bolts and the foundation lanes of adaptation studies first, but that can be like 10 to 15 minutes. And then I like visual examples. So, I mean, the examples I've given for years are these couple of scenes in Harry Potter that I can do with my eyes closed now because they just work so well. But find a clip or two that does what you want it to do. And for me, it was how pages and pages of text can be accomplished in 3 to 4 minutes of film, or 30 seconds of film, or 17 seconds of film, whatever it happens to be. So finding certain scenes that are just played out well. And one of my favorites is Lavender Brown and Ron in the sixth Harry Potter. They are dating, and it is towards the end of their relationship where it's starting to get a bit sour. And he's kind of over her, and she's getting more and more attached and kind of clingy. And they're on the train, and the doors are closed, and she comes up to the carriage window and breathes on it and draws this heart and says R plus L, and then goes, I miss you, at the window. And you just see Harry like playing with this thing on the door, like trying not to make eye contact, and Ron going like, it's so cringy. It's so awkward. And it takes like 8 seconds of film time. And it's probably about 30 pages of text of how long it takes their relationship to sour. So, giving an example like that, where you can just be like, look, that's what they had to accomplish. Yes, I miss those 30 pages, but they had to get from the relationship being a lot of fun and teenage make out sessions to being over. How do you do that real quick? A scene like that. So being able to build in some examples where they can see the power of adaptation. And then I'll try to do one with a visual storytelling. So that Harry Potter example with the tent is a big one because you can talk about rule of thirds, you can talk about color, you can talk about wardrobe, lighting. The music in that was really powerful. There was no dialogue. There was a little bit of, it's called diegetic and non-diegetic sound. So there was some sound in the scene and some sound externally, but it was just such a well-constructed moment that it was really good storytelling. Okay, so I use those examples. So trying to get a few examples like that in there, getting them to talk about some of their favorite adaptations. What's your favorite book? What's your favorite film? Did you know that that film was based off of a book, or that comic book turned into a video game? Or, all adaptations can be different styles and platforms too, and just different strengths and abilities of platforms is a nice conversation because it keeps it positive. What can a video game do that a book can't? Interaction. You get to be a part of it. You get to control narratives. Well, that's cool. Let's talk about that some more. You get to go inside the story, so you can play around with that. And then giving them an exercise or an activity where you give them all the same paragraph of text. And if they're young, or if they've never done anything like this before, don't have them do it by themselves. Have groups of 3 or 4 do a storyboard and talk about how they would shoot that. That's also real interesting because they're never going to agree. So just the conversation about what they want to do, what they think they want to do, is going to be example enough about how difficult adaptation is.
So I'm loving these ideas, and I know I'm gonna look at these things a million times over the next time I watch A Muppet Christmas Carol. I'm gonna look at these different scenes, and I'm gonna look at the characters and how they're portrayed, and it's gonna make my heart all warm and fuzzy this holiday season.
That's the goal. Yeah,
That's the
have fun
goal.
with it, and anything because there's so many films coming out in the next couple of weeks as well. Christmas is a huge adaptation joyride.
It is, isn't it?
Let yourself enjoy them. Like and controversial, but if it's now like now if I go to the cinema and it's something that I'm not working on or studying, I'll often not read the book first. I'll go see the movie first.
Mm.
That's kind of counter to what you will hear anybody who says they love books say. They want to read the book before they see the film. Why? Go see the film and enjoy it. And if you liked it, then you get to read the book and you get so much more. It's like your own special DVD special features. Like the only negative I'm finding is that I don't get to create that world in my head. I'm already picturing the characters and
Mm.
the world from the film, but I don't really mind that. And then I
Yeah.
really do enjoy both because they're such different platforms. Whereas if you're reading the book and then you go see the film, something's always missing and it's tough.
Yeah. And I do work with a lot of kids who struggle with visualization. Like that's a really difficult that it's a bigger skill than a lot of people believe it is. It's if I asked some of my students, okay, make a movie in your head while you're reading this text, they're like, I don't know how to do that. Like literally,
And
how do I do that?
And some texts are really good at that. They will give you visual language. Like
Right.
Harry Potter is one of them where they're talking about like the roller coaster of Gringotts. It's so visually described what that's like that it's quite easy to paint that picture. Most texts don't do that. You
Yeah,
have to fill in the gaps. You have to create that, which is a skill, but it's also really difficult with adaptation because everybody's is going to be so different. How you
exactly.
approach that.
Yeah. So how does one director do that? How does one student do that? How does my student do that as, they're completing this exercise in the middle of class versus a director with a whole team of artists sitting around the storyboard table do it. I would want, I think, to show some of my students like how storyboarding, like some of those old like Disney storyboarding
Mhm.
camps, like camps is the wrong word. The like in the behind the scenes where they do the storyboarding and then they literally flip the paper back and forth to show that movement.
Yeah.
Ooh, that was some of my favorite stuff growing up. Love those
Yeah.
DVD specials.
They're still on Disney. You can still find all of those. The and the Imagineering documentary. That's I think it's
Oh,
5 or 6 episodes. Oh my God, it's absolute genius of behind the scenes world building, creative storytelling. I
yeah.
mean, if you want to see like adaptation in such a unique way, like take a look at Pirates of the Caribbean. Like
Mm-hmm.
we took a ride and we turned it into this franchise film that then adapted the ride because they had to get the ride to match the film that is now
Right.
based on what the ride was. And yeah, it's so great. Haunted Mansion,
It's
there's now 2 or 3 different films of the Haunted Mansion.
yep.
Yeah, they're
Including a Muppet version.
including a Muppet version. Fantastic.
Someday they'll fulfill my dream of doing a Muppet version of Les Miserables.
Or Lord of the Rings. I've heard both of those, but yeah, one day.
Know if I want to. Yeah, I think it'd be funny. I mean, you've got we've
I mean,
we've already we already did a
Muppets
Veggie
doing
Tales version. Why not?
Muppets doing anything is going to be just fantastic. Bring
It
it.
is.
I'm here for
Bring it.
it. Yeah,
Absolutely. The Muppets can do no wrong, in my opinion.
agreed.
Oh,
Agreed. So yeah, good luck in your adaptation forays, but yeah, start small, start with an open mind, stay positive, and see if you can enjoy it. That doesn't mean you have to love every adaptation. It just means you have to give it a shot.
you have now given us the tools that show us how we can give it a shot instead of just playing the comparison game, because we're over the comparison game. We can have fun with this instead.
Exactly. Try to figure out the puzzle instead.
Yes, that's much more fun.
Yeah.
Much more
I think
fun.
so.
Maggie, thank you so much for this great conversation. And I hope you and Merlin have a wonderful holiday season. Hi, buddy. Thank you for being such a
You and
good
yours.
doggo.
You and yours as well. Thank you for having me. This is always fun to talk about. So glad I got to geek out.
Yay. Listeners, thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Be sure to hit the subscribe button on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or your other favorite podcast feeds. If you enjoyed listening, please leave a rating and a review as well. You can read and find out more about Teaching with Magic by visiting our website, teachingwithmagic.blog. You can leave a message on our podcast page, read past Teaching with Magic posts, and check out our book lists on our affiliate page. We also invite you to support us on Patreon. You'll have access to bonus material, our Discord channel, live Q&As, and you'll get a sneak peek at future products such as lesson plans, worksheets, and other teaching tools. The link is always available in our show notes and the podcast page on our website. Thanks again for joining us, and as always, keep making magic.